Sir Fix-a-Lot here. Today we're going to cover the front rotor and brake pad change of a 1994 Spec Miata. First, come on over here and take a look at the brake pad itself. Shining a light down here on the brake pad, you can see that there's about 1/8 of an inch of pad material left before it hits the backing plate. And that's about the limit of your brake pads, especially if you're taking this on the track. I'll show you the change out on one side. It's basically the same. You can follow the same procedure for the other side. Here are the basics for changing out the brake pad and rotor. Obviously you need a rotor. Brake pads, we use the Carbotech XP-10s for the track. Basic set of wrenches here and something to remove the wheel itself, and of course brake cleaner. Brake cleaner you're going to need in order to clean off any of the material that comes from the factory. They usually coat these in either oil or cosmoline in order to protect them from rusting. You'll want to loosen the lug nuts with the car on the ground first. Then we move to jacking the car up and then removing the entire wheel. Once you've safely lifted the car, you can remove all the lug nuts. And then of course remove the wheel itself, exposing the caliper as well as the disc. Just wanted to confirm pad thickness. If you look where my finger's pointing down here, we're looking at a top view. There's only about 1/8 of an inch of pad material left. So this is when you'll want to change them, or earlier if you want. In order to change out the brake pads themselves, we'll first remove this unit here. It's actually only one bolt and it flips up on a pivot, and then you can change the brake pads. So relatively simple procedure. Because we have to change out the rotor also, we're going to have to remove the entire housing here. And those are secured on the backside here with two 14mm bolts. When you remove this housing itself, you want to hang that because you don't want to break the hydraulic line here. Otherwise you're going to have to re-bleed the system. So you'll want to hang it up so that it's supported, so it's not putting any stress on the brake line. And then go ahead and do the procedure to change out the rotor as well as the brake pads. So right now I'm just finishing up taking out the last bolt here. And the caliper and housing itself, you'll just be able to pull that away like this. What I've done is I've perched the caliper housing on the A-arm back here, and then the old rotor itself you can just remove like that. When you buy brand new rotors, they're typically sealed in a plastic bag in order to protect them from moisture during shipping. They also tend to have some sort of a material on them that is there also to protect it from moisture. So I like to hit it with basically CRC brake clean and a clean rag itself. Try to do this procedure in a pretty well ventilated area because this stuff's pretty strong. It'll remove paint too, so watch out. You have to be careful where you're doing this. Make sure it's not too close to your car itself. And there, your rotor's clean. Back at the car, before we put the rotor back on, we're going to have to change out the pads. We're also going to have to push back the piston that comes out of this housing through the hydraulic unit because the tolerances have changed. When we put on new pads, they're going to have a much thicker material. So this gap here that you see will actually shrink down a lot more. So in order to do that, we're going to remove the center housing. I've removed this lower bolt here. It's a 17 millimeter bolt, and this will allow you to swing away the housing. This is what it would look like if you were just doing a pad change itself. The unit would come out like this, and actually the whole unit comes out. So you can store that away, and you just have your housing unit. The pads are spring loaded with these clips, so you just remove those clips from the pads themselves, and the pads will actually come right out. You'll see that they'll fit into these slots here, top and bottom, when you put the new pads in. Look at the difference in pad thickness between new versus used. Here you have very little material left. On the newer pad, there's almost ½ an inch of material. Big difference. So in order to compensate for that, we'll have to bring the piston itself back into the housing. And in order to do that, you're going to have to get some sort of a C-clamp and basically clamp that down until you can bring this piston back into the housing. You want to bring it almost to its limit itself. Not too far, but pretty much so that it is just about flush with the housing itself. Next is putting back the rotor. You take the clean rotor itself. It's just a reverse procedure. You put it back on. It'll hold on a little bit better once we have this housing completed. Essentially what you do is you put in the brake pads themselves, line them up within the housing such that you've got clearance for the inner edge of the housing and the brake pad, and you do the same for the other side. Once that's done, you just slide the unit back into place and then reassemble it with the bolts. Now that you have the housing and the pads on, you'll want to replace the spring tensioners back into the pads themselves, like such. What this does is keeps the pads separated off the disc when you don't have pressure on the brakes. It also quiets the brakes from squealing. After you do that, so you kind of have to hold them together, but after you do that, the caliper piston goes back on. You just keep it angled up, you slide in the top bolt itself, squeeze the pads together with one hand, and then just carefully slide this housing over the pads themselves. And then, sorry, I have to get clearance here on the bolt hole. Then just put in the lower bolt itself. You'll want to make sure that both the top and bottom 14 and 17 millimeters are well torqued, as well as the housing. There's two 14 millimeters there. And then you should be ready to put the wheel back on. So there you have it, brand new rotors and pads installed on a '94 Spec Miata. All new brakes and rotors need to go through a bedding procedure. You'll have to cycle through from 10 miles an hour up to 80 miles an hour, braking hard down to 10 miles an hour, back up to 80 miles an hour, and braking hard again. Do that 4 times. Let the pads and the rotors cool completely, and you should be ready to go.